everything goes into Stoplight. It's a nice searchable interface. And the number one thing that kind of led us in the Stoplight direction was combining Markdown with the OpenAPI spec. My name is Travis Goslin, and I work as a distinguished engineer at SPS Commerce. SPS Commerce is the world's largest retail network, and our goal is to build out effective and capable and performant kind of exchanges between supplier and retailer for things like purchase orders, invoices, and everything else that they need to exchange for their business day to day. My focus specifically is on developer experience. From a developer experience perspective, I'm not necessarily looking at what we build, but how we build it.
When you say developer experience, is that developer experience for your internal users, like developers internally or externally using SPS Commerce?
The major focus right now for us is internal developer experience. 90% of people use APIs, whether us internally using other people's APIs or our customers using other APIs and our APIs. But also internally, we have a polyglot ecosystem of many different languages, Go, Python, Java, .NET. And so for us, thinking about the developer experience internally of how all of our teams effectively build and consume APIs is kind of a big deal, affecting and changing the developer productivity of all the tool sets and how they do that is one of our key goals right now from an API first initiative. Being able to all speak the same language of API is something that we can't say across all the other development tool sets. So that's why it's so important.
So you primarily talk about internal developers. So it's generally internal APIs that you're building, or some of those are being exposed externally or to partners too?
Our goal is right now to leverage and build a new set of APIs, a new set of resources that will enable us to make use and think of the domain in a much different way. Our goal building out this new API platform is to be the first users of it. So ourselves, we are customers of the platform, and we have, of course, different levels and different types of APIs, whether it be system APIs or experience-based APIs or domain APIs. They're intended for different purposes and different teams across the organization. But ultimately, we're working on building the next generation platform of some of these domains and APIs today.
So getting into the team structure and design itself, do you have specific API teams, or most teams are building APIs? Are there API designers on the team? Who is responsible for designing some of these APIs and then developing them?
From an implementation approach, we kind of have a micro or a tiny service architecture approach. So we have very many deployable units that are rolling out. Across each one of those, depending on how many service teams owns, there'll be different domain technical leads or even just senior engineers for smaller domains that are responsible for putting together an open API specification. And then they're responsible for kind of starting to circulate that as a design asset as a part of an API design review with a much larger cross-functional group, who then looks at the design and thinks about it in comparison with, first of all, a larger strategy that we call an API taxonomy. And that taxonomy, kind of identifies, here's what we have today, here's where we're heading, and here's the distant future of resources and how the domains all circulate and work together. And that helps regulate some of the best practices and the approaches that we would put into it.
So in terms of API governance, it's the taxonomy, which is like a shared set of standards. Do you have a design review workflow? What other governance factors do you have in play?
For our teams that are designing and working through it, the number one thing we started with was a style guide. And obviously, I've chatted with Stoplight before about the style guide. It was your team that helped us get rolling on that. That was really pivotal in us kind of as a foundational. Can we even agree on what it looks like to page through results of an API? And the short answer is no, not everyone could even agree on the simple things, right? I mean, we're engineers, we all have an opinion, which is great. So the first part of that was building this cross-functional team of engineers from across the engineering departments come together and say, we're not building an API, but let's agree on if we were to right now, what would that look like? And so that would be, spectral API linting, where we've built, a great markdown guide, but also paired it with the spectral automation so that teams are getting that both local design as they're in their IDE punching away, but then also if they don't run it or if they don't run it on the right settings, that, as a part of their PR that they submit, their pull request in GitHub, that those will bubble up and materialize as automatically as a part of the automation. Probably the API design review process that we have is like the most critical point of connecting, the different teams, the tech strategy team, along with the stakeholders, along with the people who are building it. The design review process can be very different per team depending on what they need and where they're at in that approach. And in terms of how it functions, typically as a team, they have to bring a design. So first thing we do is we require an open API spec. And so they have to bring something to start with. Even if it's horrible or not a great spec, you can't come with a blank page. People need to see it. It's very difficult to talk about something and have everyone engaged. So we find right there, doing a design review, we're actually modifying the spec, seeing the preview output, and evolving it in pure discussion is a huge asset to just, something that used to take, weeks and weeks before now is done in an hour. For us, we start kind of, if you look at the shift left mentality of like, well, let's try and do as much as we can early on in order to, again, from an API first approach, let's catch those things as quick as possible where they're not going to cost too much money to change. We start with design and collaboration. So that leads us into our published portal or our API catalog, which is kind of at the bookend here. And that's Stoplight portal for us. So everything goes into Stoplight. It's a nice searchable interface. Obviously, you had a hand in designing that, Naman. So thanks for everything you guys have put in there. It provides us with searching across hundreds of our API projects that exist there. And the number one thing that kind of led us in the Stoplight direction was combining Markdown with the Open API spec. That really allows us to produce some higher quality documentation where we want it to be. We try to fit as much documentation as we can into the Open API spec. That doesn't always work. It just doesn't fit because there are different styles of documentation, and really an Open API spec is a reference. And so as we start to think about how-to guides and tutorials and other types of information, that's more markdown stuff. And so in Stoplight, we can combine that together, put it in one nice project and curate, how it looks and feels. Our APIs are not enablers for what we want to do. They are what we want to do in a lot of cases. They are a solution on product in and of themselves. And yes, we'll build other products on top of that, but that's the world we live in. And so thinking of them in that much different light, I think is what API first, is all about. The one big piece of the puzzle there that we're missing, that teams are struggling with, is they're saying, I want to be design first, but I'm not sure that my spec actually matches what I'm producing. And it feels, at least to them, that, well, if I generate it from code, I know it's matching one-to-one. But what they're missing out on as well is not just the reusability of all the other components, they're also missing out on the fact that you have left it inaccessible for certain people now to make changes, especially technical product owners, to make changes to documentation to the spec. They can do that really easily as a part of a design first approach, and they can't do that in code first in the same way. And I think it's also a pretty big false sense of security. I think that is just a journey that teams that have been doing it forever have to come on, and as they slowly start to use different aspects of the pipeline, they realize, in the life cycle, that the design first approach, has all these different benefits.
You talked about the catalog, like how did that come along? Like you started with a few open APIs, like who consumes the catalog? How is it created? Can you talk about the catalog more? We recognize that we needed an investment to say, okay, I need a single spot to go to. This should not be this frustrating or this hard. So once we realized that, then we started looking around and we started saying there's lots of tools that you can just publish open API specifications to. We ended up going with Stoplight because Stoplight gave us, number one, searchability across different projects, which we mentioned earlier. It also gives us the ability to integrate the Markdown. But what was important to us was recognizing the life cycle of the API. So recognizing that what I'm going to have, at least in our Stoplight output for our teams, actually needs to be what's in production, not necessarily what's in the main or the master branch of source control. Then we took the pipelines that we were using, and we had recently gone through an effort of standardizing tooling, and we were all moving towards CI/CD as a part of Azure pipelines.
And so we took the opportunity to hook in there, and we have built reusable templates that allows us to start publishing everything automatically to this catalog. We just start seeing new APIs show up every day of things that are running through the pipeline, and all of a sudden you get a sense of the scope of APIs that you're working with that we maybe didn't even really have an idea of before.